Part 1. Shadows over Cold Valley. Annie stood by the window, gazing at the endless expanse of Cold Valley. The morning fog enveloped the village, creating a sense that the world outside was detached from reality. She ran her hand over the glass, as if trying to erase that feeling of non-existence. This house was over 100 years old, and every corner remembered the stories of generations that had passed through its walls. But none of these stories were as dark and sinister as what awaited Annie and her family. Her husband, Tom, and son, Jack, were working in the yard, repairing the fence. The silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old well and the rustle of leaves, felt oppressive, but it was a necessary measure. In Cold Valley, sound had become an enemy. Any noise could attract something that no one dared to speak of out loud. Annie shuddered at the thought of having to leave city life for this isolation. But after she saw her youngest daughter, Sarah, being taken by the darkness, there was no other choice. It all started when Sarah was playing on the lawn in front of the house. She laughed and ran, enjoying the warm summer day. But when her laughter was interrupted by an unnatural creak and a sound resembling breaking branches, everyone froze. Tom was the first to run outside, shouting her name, but only silence answered him. Annie followed him, only to see shadows dragging their little girl into the forest. Since then, their lives had changed. They began living in constant fear, in silence, so as not to attract those who lurked in the shadows. Part 2. Warnings and Secrets. Jack, who had recently turned 12, understood that something was wrong. He saw how his mother and father communicated with each other in gestures, avoiding words. He felt that something terrible was happening around them, although his parents did not tell him the details. Old paintings depicting former residents hung in the house, and Jack often found himself thinking that some of these faces seemed familiar to him, despite their obvious antiquity. One day, rummaging in the attic in search of old toys, he stumbled upon a diary. On its cover, faded letters spelled out the records of Miles Whiter, 1923. Jack, holding his breath, opened the diary and began to read. Miles Whiter, a former resident of Cold Valley, described strange events that began to occur in the village. He wrote about how people disappeared at night, leaving only traces on the ground, about how the shadows grew thicker and more tangible, and about how one day they found a man torn apart, his screams still echoing in their ears. A chill ran down Jack's spine as he read these lines. He realized that this might be connected to Sarah's disappearance, but before he could delve further, his father called for him. Jack hid the diary under his clothes and ran downstairs. Annie, meanwhile, remembered her last visit to the old priest who had served in their church many years ago. He spoke of an ancient curse hanging over Cold Valley, and that the shadows might be the ghosts of those who had died here at the hands of witches and sorcerers. Annie couldn't shake the feeling that this curse had returned to claim them. Part 3. Descent into darkness. Several weeks passed, and the fear of the shadows only grew stronger. Tom suggested that the family pack up and leave, but Annie knew that this would not solve the problem. The shadows will find us anywhere, she said. Jack, deciding that it was time to reveal the secret of the diary, told his parents about his discovery. Tom, listening to his son, took the diary and began reading aloud. They learned that the only way to defeat the shadows was to find and destroy the artifact through which ancient forces had entered their world. Annie remembered an old legend told by the locals. Deep in the forest, where the shadows were strongest, an altar was hidden on which sacrifices were made. If they destroyed this altar, the shadows would disappear. The family decided to venture into the forest at night when the shadows were most active. They prepared for this dangerous journey, taking everything they might need. Jack, clutching the diary in his hands, felt that this was their only chance to save themselves and possibly other residents of Cold Valley. Part 4. Encounter with darkness. The night was starless and moonless. The forest greeted them with an oppressive silence that weighed on their ears, making them even more nervous. They walked, holding hands, each step taken with difficulty. Annie clutched the lantern, but its light seemed too weak to dispel the darkness around them. Soon they reached the place where, according to Miles' description, the altar should be. A dilapidated stone structure, covered in moss and ancient symbols, stood in the middle of a small clearing. Tom approached, carefully examining every detail. Suddenly, a figure leapt out of the shadows, and Annie barely managed to scream. It was the old priest, dressed in rags with a mad gleam in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "The shadows won't let you leave alive." But it was too late. The shadows began to thicken around them, as if sensing the presence of intruders. Annie, gritting her teeth, raised the lantern and directed its light at the altar. Tom took out an axe and began to destroy the ancient structure. Each blow of the axe echoed through the night, and the shadows, seemingly enraged, began to close in. Jack, holding the diary, read aloud the spells he found among its pages, hoping they would weaken the power of the shadows. The priest screamed something incoherent as the altar began to crumble. Stones fell to the ground, and the shadows, as if losing their strength, began to retreat. With one final blow, Tom shattered the central stone, and something like an explosion of light filled the clearing. The shadows screamed and dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a cold wind. Annie, trembling from the horror she had experienced, sank to her knees. Tom hugged her, and Jack, closing the diary, looked at his parents with relief. They knew the danger had passed, but the residue of fear remained. Part 5. A New Beginning. Months passed, and life in Cold Valley gradually returned to normal. Annie and Tom no longer lived in constant fear, and Jack, who had become a hero in the eyes of his peers, often told the story of how they defeated the shadows. However, despite the seeming calm, Annie couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows might return. One day, while cleaning the house, she found an old photograph of Sarah, and her heart ached with pain. But now she knew that the shadows could no longer harm them. The family continued to live in Cold Valley, surrounded by memories and hope for a better future. They knew that despite everything they had gone through, they were strong and could face any threat. And although the shadows were no longer their enemies, Cold Valley would forever remain a place where silence held its secrets. Annie stood by the window, watching a new day slowly rise over Cold Valley. She knew that many challenges lay ahead, but she was confident that they would face them together.